so the first single that we did was 1520, and that got a lot of attention on BBC One. That Zane Lowe, Paul McCartney heard that on that show and wrote us like this handwritten letter. Maybe praise is strong. He definitely loved it, but he was interested in the production. Forget the actual. It wasn't, it was like a couple lines, but it was like, "Hey guys, love the song. Are these real drums or is this a drum machine?" You know what I mean? Yeah.
Welcome to For the Record, a casual, mostly unedited conversation series presented by Greenman, where we speak with music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. I'm your host, McKeegan Voice.
Today on episode 54, I spoke with Daniel Collás. Daniel's the founder and producer of the Phenomenal Handclap Band, whose works have attracted critical acclaim as well as praise from such luminaries as Paul McCartney, Bryan Ferry, Gilles Peterson, and Sir Elton John. Aside from his work with the Phenomenal Handclap Band, Daniel has carved out a unique career producing records for some of his musical heroes, like Joe Bataan, Marcus Valle, and Gil Scott-Heron's longtime collaborator and co-writer, Brian Jackson. As a DJ, he's provided the soundtrack for countless parties and festivals in his home city of New York and around the world, including the legendary PS1 Warm Up, Croatia's Garden Festival, Munich's Charlie and Lisbon's Lux Fragile, as well as many fine nightclubs from London to Ibiza, Stockholm to Tokyo. We talked a little bit about all of this, and of course, covered a lot of great music. Hope you enjoy.
Hey Daniel, it's great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, absolutely. With all of these things, I'd like to start at the beginning and just get a sense of you and your background. So if you would mind sharing where you're from and when your relationship with music started.
The whole background? The whole
Well,
how far back are we talking about?
like the origin of like when your relationship with music started and what that looked like.
Yeah, okay. So I guess I started playing drums as a kid. Are we going back that far?
Yeah, like the first entry point. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So I started playing drums as a kid, and then I kind of got obsessed with the Hammond organ, like, in my teen years. I was like a mod, and then I got really into like rock steady and soul music and stuff like that. And then from there I started DJing. That's so I grew up in San Francisco, and I moved to New York when I was like about to turn 18. And then I came to New York to study jazz. So I went to the New School Jazz program for percussion, to be a drummer. Jazz percussion, which sounds ridiculous to mention as like to get like your BFA in jazz percussion. But that's what I did. And then shortly after I graduated, or like kind of while I was still in school, there was a Hammond organ at the school, so I started like getting involved with playing that, and then I started getting all these different jobs playing organ in bands. And then there's really no place to like practice if you're not in school, you know what I mean? Like having a drum set and being able to practice and stuff.
Yeah.
So basically I just gradually shifted into keyboard instruments. And it was also easier to lead a band and to write and everything like that from behind the keyboard as opposed to behind the drums,
Right.
I feel like the drummer is usually the last person anybody wants to hear from in like that type of setting. And then, so then, eventually from there, I started like when we would record, I was always the one in the band paying attention to the recording process, that kind of thing. I'd always kind of been interested in it, and also way more into making records than like playing live, So eventually started spending more time in the studio, and then I had an opportunity to. We had booked a session at Daftone, the original Daftone, before it moved to Bushwick. And the band that I was in at the time broke up, but we still had the studio time. And around that time I met Joe Bataan, or I had met him and connected with him. And I asked him if he wanted to, we still had the studio time at this place, and Daptone wasn't really like that big a name at the time. So I was like, we have this, this session booked, and we have some songs, and do you want to come in and sing? He's like, yeah, it'd be great, Um, so I did the first 45 with him. That was Chickaboom and Cycles of You, and that came out on that Spanish label eventually. And then that's that label Vampy Soul from Madrid. And then eventually it was like, let's make an entire album behind that. And then we did that all at Daptone when by that time they had moved to Bushwick. And I think that session took place right before the Amy Winehouse session.
Okay.
Because I remember going back there for like to pick up the tapes and them saying, because I was sort of like the resident, like long-haired weirdo over there and who had spent time in England and stuff. And they're like, Daniel, do you know, we just recorded these two women from England. There was Lily Allen and what's the other one's name? And they're like, Amy Weintraub. What was it? It was like that. And that ended up being Back in Black.
Hmm.
And yeah. And then it just kind of like, just went from there and just spending more and more time producing and recording. And then Phenomenal Handclap Band was like, I think the first record came out in 2009.
Mm-hmm.
And that was sort of like an excuse to just get all these people together that I'd wanted to work with and I'd run into. I was DJing a lot in the city at that time. Yeah, I guess I left out all the part where I started DJing at big clubs and stuff in like the early 2000s. And like the club here that was kind of the beginning of Electro Clash was Spa. And I was a DJ in kind of like a promoter, but more a DJ there.
Mm-hmm.
But I was not interested in that kind of music at all. I was only playing like soul and kind of like rare groove and stuff and like, like funk 45s. I really did not like the idea of what was happening with like Electro Clash and all of that. Except for then like only a few years later, I got really into like Italo and like dance. That was sort of my real entry into like dance music. And then I was like, oh man, this would have been great to be playing at those Electro Clash.
Yeah.
So all of that, yeah. So all that was sort of concurrent, you know what I mean? Like those two things.
Right.
And then in like, yeah, like so yeah, I got really into like, I was playing Subtonic here was like a big one. There was like turnover for the residencies was kind of high, but that was a big that's when I got really into like I would used to just call it disco, but now I guess people still think of disco as only the Bee Gees and ABBA. It's just really weird in this era, but
And true.
so then I was calling all that stuff disco, but that was basically anything that had like, it's four on the floor and congas and you know what I mean? Like all like the Lindstrom and Prince Thomas was starting to get big around that time. And that was like the mid 2000s. And then, yeah, so then kind of off of my interest in all of that stuff, I started working on the first Phenomenal Handclap Band record. And then, yeah, and then that sort of like takes us, more or less to where we are right now.
Cool.
Yeah.
Cool. Thank you for sharing. I'd love to go back to the early drum days when you got a BFA in percussion, and I'm curious, what was the inspiration for like, really pursuing that? And like, who are some of the drummers you're listening to? What was some of the music you were listening to at the time? And is that still like a skill set? Do you still like play jazz drums at all ever in your life?
No, I do not. It's funny because I occasionally will meet other like sort of ex-jazz guys, and I'll, like other producers like Jason Kriveloff or like there's guys like that I'm like, oh, we should get together like let's like an informal like jazz thing, because like everybody has like this affection for it, but nobody has been keeping up with it. I mean, in this crew of like kind of dance music people who have some sort of jazz background. Yeah, and it's always not always, but it had been talked about. It would get, like occasionally you meet somebody like, oh, cool, do you still play? No, not really. Okay, well, we should do sort of like getting a card game together or something.
Yeah.
But no, that never comes up. And only like a few years ago, the thing is about going to jazz school and being like forced to listen to it. to the extent that you're listening to it, and and like just the rigors of like a like a really concentrated criteria like that is like when I got out of school, when I finished, and I was there for like 3.5 years because I had done like a little bit of junior college in California before I moved. I never wanted to hear that music again. I never wanted like anything that even like the stuff that I kind of favored was like that kind of the organ combo stuff, right? And the stuff that was like, it was usually like Idris Muhammad was a big guy, or Bernard Purdie. Those are like my two guys in that world, that like my entry point. So like those Lou Donaldson records, or Lonnie Smith, or like Jack McDuff, like the kind of the more like soul influenced jazz is what I was really into at first.
Yeah, makes sense.
Right. And even those records that like, if there's like the melody, like the head, they call it, and then you have like the solo section and then the head again, and then that's the end of the song. That format, I didn't want to hear anything that had that, but so I started with that kind of stuff. Like I was, like I was saying before, I'd come out of soul music. I was really into like Booker T and the MGs. That's still like number one for me. And then the Meters, I got really into the Meters. I had the opportunity to study with Zigaboo, who was the drummer from the Meters, before I left. So that, that I had that whole thing happening, and I wasn't really that into like, straight ahead jazz, as we called it, like, bebop or any of that. I didn't get into that till I moved to New York, which is weird because there's people who were clearly like growing up playing that when I got to school. Like people had been playing that since like grade school,
Right.
And that was there as, this is like, I was like 18 and I was like, I barely know how to play this stuff. It was like a weird experience. And and then then you're like listening to it and like people are talking about it all the time, and, sort of get drawn into it. I mean, that's what you're there to do,
Right. Yeah, cool. I remember we had Jason on the show not long ago, and he talked about his jazz background and like sort of falling out of love with it, coming into New York, going to clubs, like going to Smalls, and
yeah, totally, that was a big one.
There'd be like 25 young musicians out there, just like, all, he talked about it as this like very toxic, hyper competitive environment, which like wasn't fun to be in, and like antithetical to like, what jazz is supposed to be. This more like fluid conversation between people, and their instruments. Which is kind of sad. I mean, and I mean, he kind of talked about it in the same way. I mean, I'm a big jazz fan. I'm not, I'm not a jazz musician, so it's always it's been interesting to hear people talk about it, in that context of like, coming up in that world, really, pursuing it from an academic, perspective, and then leaving it immediately after that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, I think that's, I mean, maybe that's how it is when you study anything like that, anything creative, that you just inundated, and then you're like, okay, I need to break, at least need a break. I mean, the weird thing, well, not weird, but like maybe I didn't really get like a streaming service until like 2017, because it's just record collection, etc.
Right.
Maybe 2017, and it was sort of by accident. I got like this streaming service, and then I was like, oh, I can look up all these records that I like, because buying jazz records can be like a dicey proposition because they're usually expensive just by virtue of being a jazz record. A lot of shop guys have that attitude. And like you're like, well, how badly do I want to like put on this record when I could be buying these records that I'm going to DJ or something? You know what I mean? It becomes that type of thing. So anyway, like at some point around then, like 2017 or 18, I got this service, and it's gonna sound ridiculous, but like I was like, oh, I could just like look up all these jazz records, and I would get like hopped up on coffee every morning and just be like, oh, like all these records that like I'd seen on the wall or heard like seen in like the discographies of a lot of my favorites. So anyway, I had this like new appreciation for jazz, and like I'm still kind of in that phase now.
Oh, cool.
And got really deep into Horace Silver, and like I'd always really loved Art Blakey and stuff, and like refining those tapes from school and like my CD collection from school and stuff like that, and which is more like studying because like when you're trying to like listen to stuff again and again to like capture, to copy a lick or whatever, you're not really listening to records as much. I mean, it's just, you can, but it's easier to do that on like a digital thing where you can just rewind it a little bit and listen to it again and again.
Right.
So, man, I haven't talked about this in a while. This is weird, but good.
That's what we're here for. Cool. So yeah, before, when you were talking about your history, you kind of brought us up to the Phenomenal Handclap Band, and that's been, an identity that has persisted, but also alongside that, you've had like, you've been producing records, you've been DJing, and I wonder if you could talk just a little bit about, how you've balanced these different musical identities, these different musical containers over the past, whatever, 12, 15 years.
Well, I think I like to just see like the through line through all of it, because like I mentioned, when I got seriously into dance music, like in the mid 2000s, and I was like, DJing like only that I'd already played like a little bit of disco in all of my sets, or like stuff that was kind of looking in the window of disco, but not actual. And again, like finding the stuff that you like, because I was saying before, like when, there's still people that I encounter that are only talking about ABBA and Bee Gees, and I'm like, what? Like how? Or or they're talking about that really, like, anyway. It's just a point of it's like just getting and finding the stuff that you like, and then sort of cherry picking the ones that you like and like making that your sound. So similar. That's just one genre, but if you're talking about like the entire thing, like what the through line is between all these things, so, and also the just like the contrast between, so like when I was getting into that, to finish that thought, I was also getting into all this like Eastern European like psych from like the late 60s and early 70s. It was sort of like Prague, but when you think about Prague, often you're talking about like Yes or like Rush or something like that. But these were like Eastern Europeans generally, or like Turkish, and they're trying to do their best they can with, like their limited, you know what I mean? They didn't have like, they weren't going to England all the time to record or whatever, or they didn't have like state of the art studios. They're doing things a little bit more DIY, or at least it sounded like that. So like that sensibility, and then also bands like Dunyan, which I got into around that time, that I'm like, still really love. Yeah, I can't really think about other bands from that era that I love as much as I love them. I know those dudes pretty well, so this is kind of, hopefully they won't see this. It's a little bit embarrassing. I love you guys. No, but their whole like, I had never really known about that like Swedish sound before, like this kind of Swedish folk sound, which that band has they're in debt to that sound, essentially. It's the same way when you hear like Turkish stuff, like even as recent as Elton Gun, those are mostly like folk songs that they're reinterpreting, and there's a similar thing with Dunyan. Like they have like these, I mean, they're taking these elements that were pre-existing and making them their own,
Right.
But I bring all this up to say that the comparison and contrast, like those two things together, like this kind of like Italo disco, for want of a better term, like that's that sound, or disco from that era, and then this kind of like pastoral, like psychedelic rock, like those two things made sense to me as being kind of like this yin and yang, and like a lot of people I knew didn't understand that, but I like, there's like this melodic element, and then this kind of like Mitch Mitchell style drumming over here, and then there's just like the heavy arpeggiators, and like this really orchestral use of synthesizers over here, you know what I mean? And they don't have to meet, but if they do, it's really nice,
Right.
And if you could figure out how those two things make sense and not make it sound like two disparate, like random ideas that are just shoved together,
right?
So yeah, that's kind of like a smaller microcosm of like the bigger picture of like all the stuff that I try and do,
Cool. Yeah, I feel like those sort of creative associations, that you make, if you can find the through line between these like really disparate, sort of styles, or that like are ostensibly disparate, but not actually, if you can find a through line, and then that collectively is your kind of musical identity, and like pulling through through that through line. Yeah, I mean, I feel like that's when the magic happens, when you can make that work.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, that's to me really inspiring. That's what keeps me doing it all this time. Is like finding these things to be inspired by, and figuring out how they can fit together, or even if it's not a case of fitting things together, like it leads you to something else.
Yeah, totally. I have to ask, because I've seen in a couple different places that your music has earned praise from Paul McCartney, and I'd love to hear the story behind how that came to happen.
Yeah. Well, so the first single that we did was 1520, and that got a lot of attention on BBC One, that Zane Lowe, and coincidentally in Triple J in Australia, Zan Rowe. Anyway, so Paul McCartney heard that on that show and wrote us like this handwritten letter. It was like this thing that, like, did this actually happen? Like we heard from the like management and all that whole shebang, the radio station, the management, they're all like freaking out about it. And then there's this letter, and then they actually sent us the letter, and it was, but he was, maybe praise is strong. He definitely loved it, but he was interested in the production. He was like, did you guys use real drums on this, or is this a drum machine? That was his, he's like, the song is, forget the actual, it wasn't, it was like a couple lines, but it was like, hey guys, love the song. Are these real drums, or is this a drum machine? You know what I mean? Yeah. So,
yeah.
Which is, that's nice to hear from like the, that's like
Paul McCartney.
Paul McCartney. Yeah.
Yeah.
Also a good drummer.
Yeah. Totally. Do you still have the note?
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
It hasn't been framed. Seems like it should be framed, but no.
I was gonna say, I thought maybe you were gonna put, it's like right back here on the wall.
Yeah, no. Next to my Emmys.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Who's somebody, given your particular intersection of musical interest, who's somebody like who's within that realm who you have never worked with but would love to work with?
I don't know. I've had a chance to work with a lot of the older guys, like that whole thing where they say, don't meet your heroes and all of that. Yeah, just by like, yeah, that's an interesting one. Well, it's funny because we're working on a new record right now, and the first couple conversations with the label was like, who do you guys want to work with? Like with, like this sort of collaborative type of thing, feature some artists here and there. But, I've done a lot of collaborating with a lot of people who end up, like I just, most recently produced that record on Brian Jackson, who is like, the coolest, like anyway, I've worked with him. I've worked with Marcos Valle, Ned Doheny. I feel like I'm forgetting. Well, Joe Bataan, like I mentioned before. Yeah, it's funny. Like, and then just collaborative process of like these, like the scene now, the people that we get to play with now and include on stuff now. It's like, I guess I don't really think about who it is. Like on that list, for example, we were talking, just taking big swings or just thinking people who would be fun to work with, like Suzanne Chani. That would be amazing. I assume, she seems great. Like I love her music. Like geez, I don't know. You caught me off guard with that one. Yeah.
Sorry.
No.
It may not be the last time that I catch you off guard with a few more questions.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know what to tell you, buddy.
If anyone comes to mind, let me know.
I'll shout it out in the middle of a different question.
Yeah. But that seems like a decent segue into part 2 of the conversation, where I do ask you a few more questions that may catch you off guard.
Wait. I've never worked with Booker T, and he's still alive and he's still around.
There you go.
That would be a weird one because I feel like I'm so into his sound. It's not not like currently every stage of my life, but that's somebody who I'm super familiar with. So it seems like it would be, I don't know, but yeah, that's a guy for sure. I would love to work with him. Yeah.
I mean, maybe he'll hear this, and this will be the beginning of a beautiful collaboration.
Yeah, sure. Anyway.
But yeah, so in part two, I ask you a few more, kind of more pointed questions about your music listening, and the first question is how you discover music, and if you could answer that through some of your favorite music curators and or outlets or platforms that you spend time with.
Okay. Yeah, I guess it ends up being, there's like a film element, or and like these sort of like cinematic TV shows that have been coming out the last few years, like the HBO shows and things like that.
Yeah.
So I don't actually know who the curators would be, but I mean, there's something about revisiting music or hearing. Well, so there's that movie. What is that movie that Zoe Kravitz recently directed?
Oh yeah, the one with like Channing Tatum and
Yeah,
like Island one.
right. That's the one. I forget what that is called. Let's just talk about the different details, but not know the name of it. Like,
yeah,
I can't remember what it's called.
I can't remember.
But that movie had "Ain't Nobody" by Shaka Khan in this like dance scene, and it was like I had never heard the song before. You know what I mean? It was like I've heard that song so many and blocked it out so many times.
It's like new context.
Like,
yeah.
Totally. And also just like, oh shit, this is great. Like the whole intro and everything like that, and like those big guitar chords. I mean, it's just been white noise to me, I guess, all this time. And suddenly I'm like, oh my God, this is great, And some of it is like you're caught off guard in this thing where you're not expecting to hear it, or it comes in from the very beginning instead of just like, blaring out somebody's window and in the middle, on the hook, which is usually how you'd hear that song unless you put it on for yourself. But hearing it from the very beginning in this kind of like setting where you're just totally focused, kind of like on something else, more the image than on the music. But I find that happens to me a lot. I found a lot of music that way. And then, so that's like rediscovering something, but then just finding something, especially in the last couple of years with labels like Numero, which apparently is actually pronounced numero for some reason, and just like reissuing all of these like back catalogs of reissuing or issuing for the first time. There's been via like all the DSPs, like just there's so much more music available.
Yeah.
Now than there kind of, especially old, specifically older music, that has been available. So like it used to be guys like David Holmes or somebody who would like do the soundtrack for like Ocean's 12, right? Which that was a big one. Like there was like stuff on there you assume is his soundtrack, like his score, but then that's where I heard Dynasty Crisis for the first time, or is it Umiliani? There's this really cool version of Caravan, and you're like, is this also David Holmes? Like what, And then you find that these kind of like obscure, like soundtracky things.
Yeah.
What was the what are we talking about? What was the question?
How you discover music.
Yeah. Okay. So I guess that's the way. Yeah. A lot through film. I'm not up on curators and music supervisors and things like that so much. It's not like I follow them, but I mean, I think that's probably like a pretty consistent way, especially lately,
Yeah, that's cool. I don't think anyone's ever given that answer before about kind of like representing music, or that's just that sort of contextual representation of, being paired, within like a visual narrative as really having an impact on, how you appreciate the music. I think that makes total sense.
Right.
Okay, next question for you. What's the first album you ever purchased, and what's the most recent?
The first album was This Our Two Tone, which is it's like a two-tone compilation that had the specials. I think it had like my older sister's boyfriend came over on his Limbretta and was telling me about the specials, but I'd never like actually heard them, Maybe that was that. So like that had the specials and Selector, English Beat, and Madness. I think it had On My Radio by Selector, which is still like, I'm kind of surprised that hasn't come out as some like this like left field type of disco jam. You know what I mean? Like that kind of like disco not disco type of thing, because that, I mean, that would be, and I've played it like that in that context a couple times. But I guess not having like a really great pressing of it, it also hurts. But anyway, that was the first one. Most recently, I got this Bo Hansen record. I just got back from San Francisco for the week, and I was doing some record shopping out there. And I got the Bo Hansen record, Attic Thoughts, which, you know, that's like a record that I've become super familiar with, like through my Swedish, my Stockholm connections. But I just, you never see it over here. And if you see it there, it's like a ton of money, because there's been a kind of renaissance for that stuff.
Right.
But Bo Hansen is like, I mean, you know, he's really high on the list for me in terms of like inspiring people who's unfortunately not with us anymore. But yeah, he's like that whole era of Bo Hansen, kind of like post Hansen and Carlson, really, really great, you know.
Cool. Who are 3 artists of note that you heard for the first time in the past year or so? They don't have to be new artists, just new artists, you know, to you.
Man, there was one recently that I was like, oh, I guess I just have never heard this before. 3, dude, we're lucky if we get one. I don't.
You can cheat too if you've got something in front of you. If you want to like look through your record collection, et cetera, et cetera. You are
that I don't have in front of me.
Resources.
For some reason, I don't have any of that in front of me. But okay, so that I've heard, like of note that I've recently discovered.
Yeah.
Well, okay, can I say this? I just was having this conversation not like 20 minutes ago about the Talking Heads. And when I was a kid, kind of before I got into all like the mod stuff, I was really into the Talking Heads, you know, like 12 years old type of thing. And now I really can't stand David Byrne. At the time, I was really into them. I don't know if it was just him I mean, obviously the whole band was great, you know, in their various eras. But it is interesting that now I really can't stand him. Like, it's not like he's in a lot of stuff that I have to like block him out, but just, you know, anytime it comes, like there was some footage of him recently, like practicing his dance moves for like Stop Making Sense or something. And I was like, dude, this makes him like even worse in my opinion. Like you couldn't just come up with that stuff. You had to practice that awkward herky jerky bullshit. Okay. But then the weird thing is I traced it back to, I didn't get into Roxy Music and Bryan Ferry until like pretty late in life, you know? So I think the first time I heard Do the Strands by Roxy Music, I was like, oh, this is where David Byrne got all of his shtick from. It's like largely by copying Bryan Ferry, you know? And it just came really clear. And I think that might be a tenuous connection, because I've mentioned this to other people who are like, no, absolutely not. But I mean, there is footage of them doing Do the Strand probably on like Top of the Pops or Old Grey Whistle Test or something. And it's like clearly the blueprint for David Byrne, you know? So my very tenuous line of connection between that answer and your question is I didn't get into Roxy Music till late.
Okay. So we'll say Roxy Music.
Yeah. it wasn't recently, but it was like, you know, a few years ago. And it seems like most people would have gotten into them by then, you know,
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah.
I feel like everybody's got a few of those. It's just like, you know, it's a band that I've like heard the name of a million times, but for some reason don't listen to, or just like don't interact with until you're like, you know, 30 or something.
Sure. Yeah.
So no more, just Roxy Music?
That's the only one that I could like really think of for some reason. I feel like I just recently went through a thing with AC/DC, but there's no way that I can tell you that I didn't hear them before then. I mean, you know, that was, you know. But and even that, it was more just like listening to it with new appreciation, because that thing happens when you like, going back to that thing I was saying about getting really into jazz again through having like a streaming service.
Right.
Is you know, you can just like spend time with these bands that you heard like one song by or
Yeah.
something. You know, you like listen to their entire album, their whole discography, or as much as is up there, and like,
Totally.
oh, okay, this is what they're about. You know?
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I've done that. I did that recently with Bjork. It was like, I've listened to like, I knew like her hits, like her pop hits, and then suddenly I had this realization. I was like, oh, all these musicians that I've heard of ever in my entire life have like at least 20 times as many songs as I've ever heard. And now I have an opportunity, like I can go spend time with their entire discography with like 20 artists, and I'll come out of my room in like 3 years time just listening to that. There's so much music though, just those people, which is pretty great.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I recently at some point tried to with the Dead. I'll bring up Grateful Dead. This kind of fits into your question, but I wouldn't say that it wasn't a positive experience. It was kind of like, okay, can someone just point me in the direction of what Dead I should listen to, because I have never liked that music. And it seems like it should, at some point, like when they first started, like right when they became the Dead from the Warlocks, it seems like there should have been. I generally like that time period.
Yeah,
it's very difficult for me to like not like that sort of late 60s, early 70s type of, you know what I mean, in general. And so I was like, okay, let me just take a stab at this. Let me, like what we were just saying, let me just see what their discography, because their records never really come up in conversation except for like Shakedown. Yeah, Shakedown Street, it's like things that like we would DJ or something. But anyway, I could not find what the attraction was to the Dead. There was it was a unsuccessful experiment.
Well, there's a lot of music out there. Maybe sometime though, you'll find your thing, your resonant point.
Yeah, right, exactly.
Contact. RP Phil Lesh, also.
Yes, also.
Cool. Well, if anyone else comes up as we're talking, feel free to shout it out. Okay, here's the big question for you. You're going to a desert island and you get to bring 3 records with you. What are they?
Okay, that Shocking Blue record,
the
one that I guess is sort of like a compilation, the one that made it over to the US, the one with Send Me a Postcard and Love Buzz, and the one. Okay, so that probably that Booker T record with their, okay, I'm just not going to know the names of all these, I guess, of any of these, but it's either called Meditation, or I think it's called Meditation. Anyway, it's the one that they're all on the dock, the one that has Soul Limbo.
Okay.
I think that the reason I don't know that one is because the cover and the label that I have they have 2 different titles, like they were playing around with it or something.
Got it.
Soul Limbo, I think it's called, or Head or Tails or something. Anyway, that one. So those 2 records. What the hell would be the third one? Man, I want to say the Rascals Freedom Suite, maybe.
Nice.
Yeah, let's go with that.
Cool. Yeah, I think it's an impossible question. Just go with what comes to your gut first.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Cool. Great. That was pretty quick.
Yeah.
I think on average quicker than most to get through those.
I'm definitely having internal dialogue right now that I'm like, no.
Yeah, you forgot about me.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, that's inevitable. But cool, man. That's you made it through the gauntlet. For folks who are out there listening who want to get involved, follow along with your music, come see you DJ, where's a good place for them to do that?
You mean like socials, like that?
Yeah, socials.
Yeah, I mean, I guess our Instagram, and our Instagram will lead you to our link tree. So it's just phenomenal _handclap.
Cool. And then now that you, or especially since you were an answer to this question, now that you have been on For the Record, who is another music head that comes to mind that we should invite on the show?
Have you guys talked to Greg Kaz?
No.
Yeah, you guys should probably talk to Greg Kaz. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, he's like this DJ around here. I mean, he's like kind of legendary, and he's like a, he's really like a not like a dictionary, an encyclopedia. But Greg, have you talked to Christine Barilli?
No.
Oh, also really good one. I should have said her first. Shit. Yeah.
You
One
can
of those
send both.
two. Okay, both of them. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah. Really, really interesting conversations to be had with those two about music
Amazing.
and perspectives and stuff. Yeah.
Cool.
And also, can I mention that we have a 12-inch coming out tomorrow, a Phenomenal Handclap Band?
Oh, sure. Yeah, for
That
sure.
would be terrible if I didn't mention that. Yeah, this it's like this private press label, Lone Limited, is doing a 12-inch of two of our new songs that were recorded and mixed in Stockholm, and yeah, there will be links on our socials for that stuff.
Cool. Awesome. Congrats on the release.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, cool, man. Well, that's all I got.
All right. Thanks very much.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Thanks for being here. Really appreciate, you taking the time, enjoy the chat.
Right on. Likewise.
All right. Cool. All right, man. Take care.
Take care.
Thanks everyone for being here. That is a wrap on another episode of For the Record, a conversation series with all manner of music heads about their stories and the music that makes them. It's a production of Grey Matter and the new Crate Coalition experiment in building connective listening graphs. We stamp every music mention that you heard here, from the names of musicians to DJs to journalists to venue owners. And in the background, we're mapping these names to form those yet unseen connective threads between. Want to get involved? Check out our website, greymatter.fm. It's Grey with an E. Or you can come hang out in the Crate Coalition Discord. We'll see you next time.